to Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. At Oxondear night, once more I tread upon English ground, which I like not the worse for the 6 weeks' ramble I have made among the woods and mountains of Caledonia, no offence to the land of cakes, where bannocks grow upon straw. I never saw my uncle in such health and spirits as he now enjoys. Liddy is perfectly recovered, and Mrs. Tabitha has no reason to complain. Nevertheless, I believe, she was, till yesterday, inclined to give the whole Scotch nation to the devil, as a pack of insensible brutes, upon whom her accomplishments had been displayed in vain. At every place where we halted, did she mount the stage, and flourished her rusty arms, without being able to make one conquest. One of her last essays was against the heart of Sir George Calhoun, with whom she fought all the weapons more than twice over. She was grave and gay by turns, she moralized and methodized, she laughed, and romped, and danced, and sung, and sighed, and ogled, and lisped, and fluttered, and flattered, but always preaching to the dessart. The baronet, being a well-bred man, carried his civilities as far as she could in conscience expect, and, if evil tongues are to be believed, some degrees farther, but he was too much a veteran in gallantry, as well as in war, to fall into any ambuscade that she could lay for his affection. While we were absent in the Highlands, she practised also upon the Laird of Ladrishmore, and even gave him the rendezvous in the wood of Drumscalloch, but the Laird had such a reverend care of his own reputation, that he came attended with the parson of the parish, and nothing passed but spiritual communication. After all these miscarriages, our aunt suddenly recollected Lieutenant Lismahago, whom, ever since our first arrival at Edinburgh, she seemed to have utterly forgot, but now she expressed her hopes of seeing him at Dumfries, according to his promise. We set out from Glasgow by the way of Lanark, the county town of Clydesdale, in the neighbourhood of which, the whole river Clyde, rushing down a steep rock, forms a very noble and stupendous cascade. Next day we were obliged to halt in a small borough, until the carriage, which had received some damage, should be repaired, and here we met with an incident which warmly interested the benevolent spirit of Mr. Bramble. As we stood at the window of an inn that fronted the public prison, a person arrived on horseback, genteelly, though plainly, dressed in a blue frock, with his own hair cut short, and a gold-laced hat upon his head. Alighting, and giving his horse to the landlord, he advanced to an old man who was at work in paving the street, and accosted him in these words: "This is hard work for such an old man as you." So saying, he took the instrument out of his hand, and began to thump the pavement. After a few strokes, "Have you never a son," said he, "to ease you of this labor?" "Yes, and please your honor," replied the senior, "I have 3 hopeful lads, but, at present, they are out of the way." "Honor not me," cried the stranger, "but more becomes me to honor your grey hairs." "Where are those sons you talk of?" The ancient pavior said, his eldest son was a captain in the East Indies, and the youngest had lately enlisted as a soldier, in hopes of prospering like his brother. The gentleman desiring to know what was become of the second, he wiped his eyes, and owned he had taken upon him his old father's debts, for which he was now in the prison hard by. The traveller made 3 quick steps towards the jail, then turning short, "Tell me," said he, "has that unnatural captain sent you nothing to relieve your distress?" "Call him not unnatural," replied the other, "God's blessing be upon him. He sent me a great deal of money, but I made a bad use of it. I lost it by being security for a gentleman that was my landlord, and was stripped of all I had in the world besides." At that instant a young man, thrusting out his head and neck between 2 iron bars in the prison window, exclaimed, "Father! Father! If my brother William is in life, that's he." I am, cried the stranger, clasping the old man in his arms, and shedding a flood of tears, "I am your son Willie, sure enough." Before the father, who was quite confounded, could make any return to this tenderness, a decent old woman bolting out from the door of a poor habitation, cried, "Where is my bairn? Where is my dear Willie?" The captain no sooner beheld her, than he quitted his father, and ran into her embrace. I can assure you, my uncle, who saw and heard everything that passed, was as much moved as any one of the parties concerned in this pathetic recognition. He sobbed, and wept, and clapped his hands, and hollowed, and finally ran down into the street. By this time, the captain had retired with his parents, and all the inhabitants of the place were assembled at the door. Mr. Bramble, nevertheless, pressed through the crowd, and entering the house, "Captain," said he, "I beg the favor of your acquaintance. I would have travelled 100 miles to see this affecting scene, and I shall think myself happy if you and your parents will dine with me at the public house." The captain thanked him for his kind invitation, which, he said, he would accept with pleasure, but in the meantime, he could not think of eating or drinking, while his poor brother was in trouble. He forthwith deposited a sum equal to the debt in the hands of the magistrate, who ventured to set his brother at liberty without farther process, and then the whole family repaired to the inn with my uncle, attended by the crowd, the individuals of which shook their townsman by the hand, while he returned their caresses without the least sign of pride or affectation. This honest favourite of fortune, whose name was Brown, told my uncle that he had been bred a weaver, and, about 18 years ago, had, from a spirit of idleness and dissipation, enlisted as a soldier in the service of the East India Company, that, in the course of duty, he had the good fortune to attract the notice and approbation of Lord Clive, who preferred him from one step to another, till he attained the rank of captain and paymaster to the regiment, in which capacities he had honestly amassed above £12,000, and, at the peace, resigned his commission. He had sent several remittances to his father, who received the first only, consisting of £100, the second had fallen into the hands of a bankrupt, and the third had been consigned to a gentleman of Scotland, who died before it arrived, so that it still remained to be accounted for by his executors. He now presented the old man with £50 for his present occasions, over and above bank notes for 100, which he had deposited for his brother's release. He brought along with him a deed ready executed, by which he settled a perpetuity of £80 upon his parents, to be inherited by their other 2 sons after their decease. He promised to purchase a commission for his youngest brother, to take the other as his own partner in a manufacture which he intended to set up, to give employment and bread to the industrious, and to give £500, by way of dower, to his sister, who had married a farmer in low circumstances. Finally, he gave £50 to the poor of the town where he was born, and feasted all the inhabitants, without exception. My uncle was so charmed with the character of Captain Brown, that he drank his health 3 times successively at dinner. He said, he was proud of his acquaintance, that he was an honour to his country, and had in some measure redeemed human nature from the reproach of pride, selfishness, and ingratitude. For my part, I was as much pleased with the modesty as with the filial virtue of this honest soldier, who assumed no merit from his success, and said very little of his own transactions, though the answers he made to our inquiries were equally sensible and laconic. Mrs. Tabitha behaved very graciously to him until she understood that he was going to make a tender of his hand to a person of low estate, who had been his sweetheart while he worked as a journeyman weaver. Our aunt was no sooner made acquainted with this design, than she starched up her behaviour with a double proportion of reserve, and when the company broke up, she observed with a toss of her nose, that Brown was a civil fellow enough, considering the lowness of his original, but that fortune, though she had mended his circumstances, was incapable to raise his ideas, which were still humble and plebeian. On the day that succeeded this adventure, we went some miles out of our road to see Drumlanrig, a seat belonging to the Duke of Queensberry, which appears like a magnificent palace erected by magic, in the midst of a wilderness. It is indeed a princely mansion, with suitable parks and plantations, rendered still more striking by the nakedness of the surrounding country, which is one of the wildest tracts in all Scotland. This wildness, however, is different from that of the Highlands, for here the mountains, instead of heath, are covered with a fine green swarth, affording pasture to innumerable flocks of sheep. But the fleeces of this country, called Nithsdale, are not comparable to the wool of Galloway, which is said to equal that of Salisbury Plain. Having passed the night at the castle of Drumlanrig, by invitation from the Duke himself, who is one of the best men that ever breathed, we prosecuted our journey to Dumfries, a very elegant trading town near the borders of England, where we found plenty of good provision and excellent wine, at very reasonable prices, and the accommodation as good in all respects as in any part of South Britain. If I was confined to Scotland for life, I would choose Dumfries as the place of my residence. Here we made inquiries about Captain Lismahago, of whom hearing no tidings, we proceeded by the Solway Frith to Carlisle. You must know that the Solway sands, upon which travelers pass at low water, are exceedingly dangerous, because, as the tide makes, they become quick in different places, and the flood rushes in so impetuously that the passengers are often overtaken by the sea and perish. In crossing these treacherous Syrtes with a guide, we perceived a drowned horse, which Humphrey Clinker, after due inspection, declared to be the very identical beast which Mr. Lismahago rode when he parted with us at Felton Bridge in Northumberland. This information, which seemed to intimate that our friend the lieutenant had shared the fate of his horse, affected us all, and above all our Aunt Tabitha, who shed salt tears, and obliged Clinker to pull a few hairs out of the dead horse's tail, to be worn in a ring as a remembrance of his master. But her grief and ours was not of long duration, for one of the first persons we saw in Carlisle was the lieutenant in propria persona, bargaining with a horse-dealer for another steed, in the yard of the inn where we alighted. Mrs. Bramble was the first that perceived him, and screamed as if she had seen a ghost, and, truly, at a proper time and place, he might very well have passed for an inhabitant of another world, for he was more meagre and grim than before. We received him the more cordially for having supposed he had been drowned, and he was not deficient in expressions of satisfaction at this meeting. He told us he had inquired for us at Dumfries, and been informed by a travelling merchant from Glasgow that we had resolved to return by the way of Coldstream. He said that in passing the sands without a guide, his horse had knocked up, and he himself must have perished, if he had not been providentially relieved by a return postchaise. He moreover gave us to understand that his scheme of settling in his own country having miscarried, he was so far on his way to London, with a view to embark for North America, where he intended to pass the rest of his days among his old friends the Miamis, and amuse himself in finishing the education of the son he had by his beloved Squinkinacusta. This project was by no means agreeable to our good aunt, who expatiated upon the fatigues and dangers that would attend such a long voyage by sea, and afterwards such a tedious journey by land. She enlarged particularly on the risk he would run, with respect to the concerns of his precious soul, among savages who had not yet received the glad tidings of salvation, and she hinted that his abandoning Great Britain might, perhaps, prove fatal to the inclinations of some deserving person, whom he was qualified to make happy for life. My uncle, who is really a Don Quixote in generosity, understanding that Lismahago's real reason for leaving Scotland was the impossibility of subsisting in it with any decency upon the wretched provision of a subaltern's half-pay, began to be warmly interested on the side of compassion. He thought it very hard that a gentleman who had served his country with honour should be driven by necessity to spend his old age, among the refuse of mankind, in such a remote part of the world. He discoursed with me upon this subject, observing that he would willingly offer the lieutenant an asylum at Brambleton Hall, if he did not foresee that his singularities and humour of contradiction would render him an intolerable housemate, though his conversation at some times might be both instructive and entertaining. But, as there seemed to be something particular in his attention to Mrs. Tabitha, he and I agreed in opinion that this intercourse should be encouraged and improved, if possible, into a matrimonial union, in which case there would be a comfortable provision for both, and they might be settled in a house of their own, so that Mr. Bramble should have no more of their company than he desired. In pursuance of this design, Lismahago has been invited to pass the winter at Brambleton Hall, as it will be time enough to execute his American project in the spring. He has taken time to consider of this proposal. Meanwhile, he will keep us company as far as we travel in the road to Bristol, where he has hopes of getting a passage for America. I make no doubt but that he will postpone his voyage, and prosecute his addresses to a happy consummation, and sure, if it produces any fruit, it must be of a very peculiar flavour. As the weather continues favourable, I believe, we shall take the Peak of Derbyshire and Buxton Wells in our way. At any rate, from the first place where we make any stay, you shall hear again from yours always, J. Melford Carlisle, September 12th.